We'll have pizza coming for everyone at about 7:10, so it'll be out here. So wherever we are kind of in process, we'll just take a short break, go out there, and then come back. Pop should be coming soon too. You can have that as well. I think your presentation is going to be about 15 minutes?
Sure.
Whatever works. And then we'll just kind of open the floor and you can ask Andrew about his experiences with, politics and the media. I was at the Heterodox Academy conference last month and they gave me a whole bunch of I support viewpoint diversity stickers, so you can come get one if you want, if you find by the end you're supporting viewpoint diversity. Without further ado, I'll present our guest today. So Andrew Lawton is a broadcaster and columnist and currently a fellow at the True North Initiative. Most recently, he hosted the Andrew Lawton Show on 980 CFPL in London and wrote a national column for Global News. His written work has been published across the world, including in the Washington Post, the National Post, Toronto Sun, Edmonton Sun, and Global News. Andrew has appeared as a commentator on CBC, CTV, TVO, CTS, and BBC World. He also ran as a progressive conservative candidate in Ontario's 2018 provincial election, and he lives with his wife Jennifer in London. So I'm pleased to introduce Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you for putting such a wonderful spin on I lost. That was a very, very nice way of glossing over a dark chapter in my life. So it's great to be here. When I had originally chatted about coming and doing a talk like this, it was about ideological conformity in the media. And that was something that I've witnessed not just in my career as a broadcaster, but also in my termination as a broadcaster. And when I decided to jump into politics in what ended up being a very short-lived stint, I saw that a lot of the same phenomena that I was really trying to raise concerns about in the media world also existed in the political world. And in a lot of ways, almost more pervasive in politics because of the level of power that exists in politics. And it's fascinating to see this because if you look at someone that screws up in whatever capacity, politics, media, the workplace, there are usually two things at stake, one of two of them. There's either incompetence or malice. And when you look at a lot of the issues that take place in media bias, when you look at a lot of the issues in politics of politicians not being allowed to speak their mind or being summarily punished by internal mechanisms for doing what they're supposed to do, you have to look at whether it's people that are just so incompetent running the show or people that are actually acting out of malice. And if you start viewing the world through that dichotomy, it's amazing how many things make a lot more sense. Because it's never anything other than those when things that are not supposed to happen, happen. And when you look at the idea of making a topic off limits, and I know this is something that Elsoy and Lindsay have dealt with very significantly on the academic level, usually it's malice. But the people that go along with it, the people that don't know any better, the people that tend to not speak up and not do what Lindsay did, these are the people that a lot of the time don't know any better. And I want to speak about both of those. When I got fired from the radio station and fired from the national media company, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on, there was something very interesting I saw. I put out a statement which was very honest. I talked about my gratitude for having had the platform and the love of what I did for the last 5 years. And on that Facebook page, hundreds and hundreds of glowing comments, people that were saying, oh my gosh, he was so great, I loved the show, and it was so wonderful, and how could they do this? And if you were to read that, you'd think, my goodness, this guy was like the greatest guy on earth. Not true, I assure you. Then CBC ran a story. And if you looked at the comments on the CBC story, you'd think I was Hitler. Oh my goodness, it's good riddance, it's good riddance to bad rubbish, glad they canned him, glad they got rid of him. We saw in two different places about the same incident, two drastically different versions of how people responded to some seemingly minor thing. Imagine if someone only looked at one of those. Imagine if someone only looked at the one and never saw the other. They would have no idea that there is another world that exists outside of their own. And this is the echo chamber. This is the vacuum that people find themselves living in. So now let's take this into the media world. Imagine newsrooms that are staffed with people that have never seen a world outside of their own. That's what exists in North American media today. That's what exists in all of the major newspapers, television stations, and radio stations. People that have come through the ranks of academia. They've taken the liberal arts programs. They've done the master's in journalism. They've done the 7-year undergrad in gender studies and conflict resolution. They've done all of that, which qualifies, don't laugh, that's what qualifies you for a job at the Toronto Star. But they do this, and they, by no fault of their own, by the time they get into a newsroom, have only viewed the world in one way. But it's not just that they have their position, they have their perspective. It's that they don't even know another perspective exists. There was a fascinating study that was done, not a study, but an experiment by a journalism professor at Harvard, of all places. And she took 10 political science students from Harvard and went to a little town called Chicopee, Massachusetts, which is about 90 minutes away from Cambridge, where Harvard is. So the distance from London, Ontario, where I came to here, they went. But it was a town of, I think, 3,000 people. And they saw, these students that went there, things they had never seen before. And I was like, oh my goodness, what happened in this town? No, the things they had never seen before were a gun range, a Polish Catholic church, and a diner where everybody knew each other's names. These are quintessential hallmarks of small-town America that these Harvard political science and journalism students had never seen in their lives. They had a grand old time, they went to the diner, they went to the Polish Catholic Mass, they went to the gun range and were shocked to see women shooting. This was something they had never seen before. And then their professor, who I don't know how she managed to get a job at Harvard, told them that that town, 90% of the people there voted for Trump. And these students were shocked. And I don't even want to use the word triggered, because they actually went through the process of trying to have an open mind. But they could not understand how all of these people that were seemingly normal and nice and had a completely lovely worldview and lovely way of interacting with one another, that they could have been Trump voters. So now this may have varying degrees of success. Maybe it will influence the way these kids or young adults view the world, maybe it won't. But imagine now the Toronto Star newsroom, the Globe and Mail, the Global News Department, CBC, and all of these other places filled with people that have graduated from various programs where they have never had to imagine that there is a group of people in the world that views the world differently than they do. And this is one of the challenges that we see in media. Whereas the media industry, which is run in Canada in particular by about 5 different companies, and this is what people fail to realize. You've got, in all of the newspaper, television, and radio properties that are existing nationwide, you've got about 5 different companies. If you want to look at radio as one example, the industry that I just vacated, there are basically 2 companies that exist in that space. So a few different executives in just a few different companies have a say in completely changing the narrative of what the average ordinary person reads or experiences as they go through their day-to-day life. And when I was knocking on doors as a candidate in the last election, we knocked on our team 20,000 doors, and we talked to people that were maybe not the equivalent of Chicopee, Massachusetts residents, but people that were ordinary, average people. And these folks, despite all that we talk about with the declining trust in mainstream media, still had an incredible level of faith and trust in the press. And it's understandable, because they would read something that Doug Ford allegedly said or something that apparently I said, and we'd say, well, actually, this is the truth. And, well, no, they couldn't print it if it wasn't true. But this is an actual worldview. People that believe, and by the way, I sympathize with them. I would love to retreat back to such an innocent point in my life where just reading something in the paper meant it had to be true. But these people that are actually saying, well, you know, they couldn't just say it if there wasn't at least some truth to it. And for all that we talk about fake news and all of these dialogues and discussions, and the one this week, I don't know if you've been following, but the environment minister didn't like that people were making parody accounts of things that she, you know, actually said. And the reason she didn't like it is because she thought her account was the only parody account that had ridiculous things. And then she actually, unfortunately, found out that her stuff was funnier than the parody account, so she tried to get the parody account shut down. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with something called the Streisand Effect. It happened where years ago Barbara Streisand didn't like this photo of her waterfront mansion being circulated, and her trying to get people to not look at it caused infinitely more people to look at it. And this is what we saw with Catherine McKenna, and this is what we saw. Now there's an entire parody cabinet on Twitter of all of these cabinet ministers that are speaking from the heart of what the Trudeau government is really all about, sunshine and roses. But the fact remains that when you look at Twitter and all of these other things that are supposed to be a microcosm of the real world, they are so far removed from the actual world and the actual experiences. But how many times have you seen a news story? And the news story is nothing more than someone said this on Twitter. And I'm not even talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about this anonymous account, Eagle Patriot 72394, said, that this cabinet minister is a B word or something like that. And this is a front page story. That, oh my goodness, this, Eagle, whatever the Twitter account was, I've already forgotten already, said something online. And here's the story about all the people that tweeted back. And we have now media outlets that view Twitter as apparently enough of a representation of the real world that that's going to be the way that they showcase what is happening in the real world to people who are still, for no fault of their own, trusting enough. Just trusting enough of the discussions and dialogues that are happening in the press. I'll tell you one story that a friend of mine shared who works in a newsroom and still talks to me. And it was where they were talking about the sex education curriculum, which is, if Doug Ford as Premier keeps his promise, will be scrapped perhaps by September, but at some point in the next year. And what was fascinating about this is that I was hearing this as a candidate at the doors from people that were actually concerned about the sex ed curriculum. People that were mostly non-white, people that had evangelical and Catholic backgrounds, also Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, people that were representative of a very broad coalition that didn't like the sex ed curriculum. They didn't like that parents weren't consulted. They didn't like that it didn't take into account different faith backgrounds about sexuality and other lifestyles. And more importantly, people that didn't like that there, in their view, was an agenda from the Liberal government. And it was about many things. The consultation, the process was a big part of it. But it was about some of the particular sex acts. It was about gender identity. It was about all of these other things. And this discussion that took place in a newsroom was, what do conservatives really not like about the sex ed curriculum? And it was a bunch of journalists sitting around a table. One of them, unbeknownst to the rest of them, was going to tell me after. And they're like, oh, they don't like that they're telling kids about abortion. And this made its way into a news story. These people have never in their lives met someone like the thousands of people that I met in my own riding and the millions of people across the country that don't like that curriculum. The people that shape the narrative of how everyone in London, in Ontario, and Canada will view the sex ed curriculum have never even met someone that has been able to articulate what their issue is with it. And now imagine this phenomenon taking place on every key issue that's supposedly contentious. And when we go to incompetence or malice, back to that dichotomy, we see a little bit of both. It's one thing to have never been exposed to another worldview. It's another thing to willfully stay in that bubble. To, instead of finding someone who's a critic of the sex ed curriculum and talking to them, to just talking around the little group of people that views the world exactly like you do. And that's where incompetence can become malice. You can only be oblivious for so long before you are actually willfully ignorant. And in the media, it's very similar. How many issues are there that no one is supposed to talk about? Now, when I signed up as a candidate, I didn't get a list of these are the things that you aren't allowed to say and these are the things you are allowed to say. Well, we were allowed to say buckabeer. I mean, that was the one that everyone had to say in Ontario. But the thing is, we never actually got a list. The political issues that you're not allowed to address are so deeply ingrained in the political culture in Canada that they're unspoken. And it's not just abortion and Islamic terrorism and Quebec separatism. We can't even talk about the price of milk in Canadian politics. I don't know if anyone followed this. Maxime Bernier, a couple of weeks ago, ejected from the Conservative shadow cabinet because he published online a chapter of a book he was writing about supply management. When the price of milk at the grocery store is an issue so contentious that you get punished for talking about it, how are we ever going to have the critical discussions on the far more critical issues and the broad spectrum of issues in Canadian politics? And I want to give you an example, a funny one, of how the media gets to define the premises for you. And I'm going to read a few paragraphs of a story that was written about me and my candidacy by CBC. This race might be a one to remember in London West. In one corner is Andrew Lawton, the controversial former radio host turned Politico. Lawton is a progressive conservative leader, Doug Ford's controversial pick for the riding. Yada, yada, yada. He's remained controversy-free during the campaign. In 4 paragraphs, they call me controversial twice before conceding that I've been controversy-free. Now, I looked at this and I just thought maybe they need one of those word-a-day calendars to get some more variety in there at least. But this is one of the biggest problems, though, is that they, without even defining the point they're making, just throw out words like controversial. And you'll see it. There are these words that if you start to tally the number of times you see them in the press, you'll start to tire of them. Controversial, embattled. Mark Stein was upset a couple of years back when they had written about him in the context of controversial author for like 8 articles, and then they decided to downgrade him to outspoken author. But this is the type of thing that we see. And the media, they're very lazy in some respects because they decide, you know what, I'm sure that everyone thinks this, so let's just say it. And imagine this happening again on critical issues. So you'll see this on anything that the media tells you there is a consensus on. You know, if you looked on Facebook today, you'd note that the Environment Ministry in Ontario had posted something that says, we may be a little quiet with our communications for the next little while the new government settles in. And this was actually a post that all government ministries had put out. And if you look at the last 10 Facebook posts from Environment Ontario before that, they were all, you know, the world is ending and, you know, every child needs to, you know, refuse a straw to end climate change and the seals are dying and all of this stuff. And now these bureaucrats in the Environment Ministry are very concerned that under the new government they might find themselves out of a job if they keep up that same level of alarmism. But again, I'm sure many people in this room have been exposed to work and research that criticizes not the existence of global warming, but certainly criticizes the alarmist overreaction and the version of it that results in all of us having to pay more and live with less. But in the academic view, the media view, and the political view, there is no discussion to be had. So when you allow political leaders or media figures to set the parameters of debate, what you're doing is you're actually allowing there to be a false consensus on issues. And our politicians do this all the time. Everything to do from abortion to the price of milk and back. When I go back to a few months ago, I was invited to be the keynote speaker of the March for Life in Ottawa. This is an event that has about 12,000 to 14,000 people coming out. It is one of the biggest, if not the biggest event that takes place on Parliament Hill every single year. Bigger than Pride, bigger than the Tamil Festival, bigger than any other event. And the March for Life gets very little media coverage. Usually they'll find the one person who has the sign that's really inflammatory and offensive and say, look what this one person out of 12,000 said. Again, it's the Twitter phenomenon. And I was invited to be a part of it, and I was very excited. I do a lot of public speaking, and I decided I was going to accept, but under the agreement I had with my former employer, I had to say, hey, just to give you a heads up, I'm going to be doing this on this day in Ottawa. And the response instead was, this is divisive, and this is polarizing, and you can't do a thing about it. Now, I don't know, because I've never tested it, but if I were speaking at the March for Celebrating the Right to Abortion, I don't think that would be divisive and polarizing. I think that would be a celebration of women's rights, a celebration of progress. Like I said, I didn't test it, so it's just a theory. I tested it a couple of months later when I was invited, actually an event that Elsoy was involved in, to moderate an abortion debate here at Laurier University. And I think they were on to me by this point because they didn't respond in writing this time. It was an office meeting where they said, well, you know, we don't think it's good for you to be at the center of contentious and controversial issues. I was a talk show host. Now, maybe, just maybe, in the 5 years from when I started to this conversation, the job description of talk show host had changed or evolved or morphed in some way. I had talked about abortion on my show. I had talked about it from the perspective of being a pro-life Christian. I had talked about it from the perspective of facilitating debates from people that view it differently. But all of a sudden, it became an issue where, as a talk show host, you cannot even facilitate a debate about an issue. And this isn't anything to do with the position itself. What's at stake is that they don't want the dialogue to take place. And as much as the abortion debate may be one that people tire of and one that is very repetitive, because very few people change their minds in the abortion debate, it's oftentimes a very good barometer of our ability as a society to discuss key political issues. There was an article that came out during the election. Here are the 13 candidates that will take away your right to choose. And I was like, oh my goodness, what did 13 candidates say? And then I was on the list apparently. But the thing was, they were going based on candidates that were endorsed by a pro-life group. And it wasn't that they were saying, here is why we think that we need to have a certain perspective and opinion on the abortion, and that's why these candidates are wrong. The premise was that someone who is pro-life is unfit to be in office. And this is an ideological purity test that has been imposed in the political world, in the media world. We're seeing it in the not-for-profit sector with the Justin Trudeau imposed Canada Summer Jobs program, an ideological purity test. If you want to receive funding for your little church day camp, you have to toe the line on abortion. And even though this isn't a talk that I wanted to make about abortion, we have to look at that issue as really the precursor to what we're going to see on other issues moving forward. Eventually, it's going to take hold of every single social belief system that people have. And if you allow it to take hold in your funding for summer jobs program, it's not long until it's actually about whether you can even have charitable status in Canada, whether you as a group can even register to give tax receipts to people, which is why even if you are not believing the particular position that has been otherized, you have to step up about the process itself. So when we talk about ideological conformity, to bring it back to the issue that I really wanted to make at stake here, never let anyone else set the premises of discourse. And understand that the debates that you're in the midst of on a campus level are filtering into these other departments. Anyone that has come through a schooling system where showing a clip of Jordan Peterson is violent, they're going to be the MPP next week. They're going to be the editor-in-chief of the Toronto Star, well, probably this week. They're going to be all of these things. If we don't deal with the problem earlier, the outcome is going to be one that we can't tackle. Thank you. I can't moderate, it's divisive. I'm not allowed to do any. Yeah, I think it's pretty casual group, and I realize there's food coming, so yes.
I just want to correct you. We call him...
we don't allow that, sorry.
Next. Prime Minister Justin Groper.
Justin Groper.
Oh, yeah.
Well, does anyone remember the Shawinigan handshake of Jean Chrétien? I decided we should start calling this the Kokanee handshake this week, and so far it's catching on. I think it got you know, a couple hundred tweets. We're getting there. It was only yesterday, but. Yeah, but therein lies a very interesting one, which is that the rules are not universal. You know, the rules are, you know, the Me Too rules. You know, if Stephen Harper so much as, you know, took a hair off of a woman's blazer, he would be excommunicated right now. Whereas, you know, Justin Trudeau can, you know, grab a woman because he thinks that she's writing for a daily paper instead of a national paper. And that all of a sudden is a line that we all have to find acceptable. And, you know, I don't think that what he is said to have done is, you know, at Harvey Weinstein levels. And I think that a lot of the conservative overreaction has been a little bit excessive. But he set the rules. He created this rule book, and now everyone else is like, well, you've got to play by it. It's not going to work, obviously.
Raising his children as feminists. He said it in Mary Claire magazine.
Yes. Well, and that's where all in-depth political analysis comes from, so yes. Yes.
I have a question. I don't know if you wanted to talk about, because I'm mostly aware, when I heard you as speaker, I'm mostly aware of the controversies, scare books that surrounded you. And so I was reading some of the tweets in question. And I guess the question I had was, there was, I guess, some, during the campaign, some backtracking from those tweets that you did. And it seemed to me, like, so in one of the articles you were like, oh, that doesn't represent who I am, it was a different time in my life, like I didn't mean any of that. It seemed to me like a lot of the tweets were comedy, maybe, and maybe not perfect comedy all of the time. But I guess, where do you square, I guess there's a tension between comedy and being a politician, and I guess what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah.
And to what extent am I misreading your intentions?
Yeah, one of the, so the backstory of this, just for people that aren't as familiar, which it's so grateful to be in a room where people might not be familiar with it, but the, you know, I was in the campaign bombarded with a lot of very old tweets and some newer comments, and people that, people tried to really conflate the two of them. And what I said in response to the old tweets from 2009, 2010 was very true in many respects, that I was going through a nasty mental health battle. I tried to kill myself in 2010. We'll get to the happier part of the evening in a second. Spoiler alert, I failed. But I'm sensing a trend, the politician, the suicide. But in any case, the things were not coming from a place of really thinking through repercussions. Now, that isn't to say that people shouldn't have the right to make whatever jokes they want. It was that for me personally, I was looking at a lot of the stuff that I wrote, and I'm like, I would not say that today. And that's the thing. Now, one of the things that I find in the comedy world that's unforgivable is if your jokes aren't funny. And I saw earlier, next week is the Queer and Present Danger Comedy Tour. So I don't expect to be headlining the Queer and Present Danger Comedy Tour anytime soon. But I do think that when I looked at my comments, I could look back at a couple of them and say, yeah, maybe that was worth a chuckle, or other ones and say, that really wasn't. But I knew the place from which it was coming from, and it wasn't a constructive place. It was, in some cases, me cribbing them from somewhere else that I had heard at the time. And look, this is, I think, an interesting example, though, because we are now at that point where those who were raised with social media around in their adolescence and young adulthood are seeking office, are seeking careers in media, are doing all of these things. And we're going to see a lot more of these types of controversies. And I feel like this week was really, or this campaign was really bad, in that 2 weeks of the campaign was this candidate tweeted this 10 years ago, this candidate wrote this on Facebook 10 years ago. And are any of us any further along in the process of really vetting people by living in the past like that? I would say no. And again, we saw the double standard, though. So there was one candidate in Toronto who had quoted Adolf Hitler. And for all the jokes I made about Muslims and gays and women and all of those things, I never quoted Hitler as a positive. I mean, there was no comedic value in that. And her defense was, well, I don't remember doing it, I must have been hacked. My defense was, yeah, look, I did this, I regret it, and I want to move on with my life. And the media moved on from the Hitler story. The media moved on from the woman that thought poppies were glorifying war crimes and still continued to double and triple and quadruple down on it. The media moved on from a lot of these issues. And I think that when you look at whatever it is, it could have been comedy or political observations or whatever the case may be, we are, as a society, a lot less forgiving when they tackle those issues that we've held up as the sacred cow. And that is religious tolerance of Islam, that is LGBTQ rights, and all of these other things. So anything that goes along those issues is going to be naturally more of a lightning rod than quoting Hitler. And there's that old Godwins Law thing where, all discussions and debates will eventually lead to the invocation of Hitler if they go along. She started there. She started at Hitler. And this is the thing. You don't need to draw the line to get to Hitler when she starts there. But I think that's where we have to take a step back and say, look, even if someone were to come up and say, no, I said all of that stuff in the capacity of trying to get a laugh, and I'm going to stand by it because it is something I'd say today. Is that something that should disqualify someone from office? The voters get to make that distinction. The voters get to make that determination. What I didn't like with me is that the media was trying to make that determination. Instead of being a vessel for it, they were trying to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. And again, that's coming from the premise where they're saying, you are not allowed to do X, Y, Z by our measure. And the media is not the one that gets to set that. Yes.
First, I want to thank you for your talk. And,
thanks.
I'd like to stick on the topic of media because I do think there's a lot of separation between the media element of this and the political element. But because essentially what you've been talking about is the fourth estate, right? Like the traditional print, radio, TV, newscasting, and what do you have to say about like independent or newer forms of media that are kind of sprouting up? Because what I feel like is happening is there's a competition going on between places like Facebook, Twitter, where people have a voice and they can gather a following and actually be as influential, if not more, than some billion-dollar corporation that has existed since the start of TV or broadcasting. So what do you say, is it really the fault with traditional forms of media who are kind of giving into this hype of this, whatever goes, like this wild west of social media, the social media scape, or is it, like, is the game totally different now with this, like with introducing new forms of independence?
The media in the traditional sense is always going to be playing catch up. And, I remember when I got my start, it was actually blogging and podcasting before everyone had a blog and a podcast. I mean, now if you have a podcast, it's like, yeah, you and everyone else. At the time, it was like, oh, what's that? And what was interesting is that we were in the blogosphere, and there was a pretty small but dedicated group of Canadian bloggers writing about stories that 3 or 4 days later we were seeing in the mainstream press. And it's not even that it was original reporting, it was that you'd get 1 or 2 bloggers that would be on something, and then you'd then see this circle start to expand it. Now it's happening a lot more quickly on both sides. The mainstream press is a lot more quick on the uptick. And you have people like Spencer Fernando and Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro and The Rebel and all of these others that are actually doing a lot and getting it out very quickly online. But the challenge with that, and I say this as someone who's now doing the online independent thing, is that there is an audience that I find is not insular per se, but an audience that isn't as directly correlated with the general population. And I saw this at the door. There are people that would have no idea what a Dave Rubin was unless it ended up on the front page of the paper that's on their doorstep or the newspaper website that they're visiting every day. Now, this is going to change as newspapers put more of their content behind paywalls. And my wife works for a newspaper. I'm sympathetic to the good people in the industry that are finding themselves on the decline right now in terms of job security. But the Toronto Star this week put a paywall up. And now if you want to read more than 5 Toronto Star articles a month, which I'm sure most of the people in the room wouldn't do for like 7 years, but if you want to read 5 Toronto Star articles in a month, which I do believe it or not, you've got to register and sign up. And they're trying to get people to sign up online now with the promise that we're going to give you free Toronto Star content, which I think is actually a bug, not a feature. But if you do that, then eventually they're going to put up the paywall anyway, and they're just going to have your email to harass you to subscribe. But when I get that paywall, what do? As someone who reads a lot of media a day, I look somewhere else for the same story because you can almost invariably find it somewhere else. There are sometimes I'll get a Globe and Mail or a Wall Street Journal column that is behind the paywall, and that column you can't get anywhere else. But is it worth the $5 a month there plus the $5 a month at every other media outlet around? No, it isn't for the majority of people. So once mainstream press has successfully walled itself off from its audience, I think we're going to see that flip to the independent media take place in a lot more of a dramatic way. But the people that are going to YouTube channels now, I feel are not representative of the masses yet. And it's like what I said earlier about my own campaign. The discussions that were happening on Twitter were so far removed from what average voters who, like 2 days before the election, were like, oh, I haven't given any thought to who I'm going to vote for yet. Those are the people that you need to reach. Yes?
I'd like to address that because I'm a member of a small group that's trying to form up to try to address some issues that will be upcoming in the new federal election coming up. But one of the concerns that we have is that there's this big gap where there are people for whom, unless it appears in mainstream media, they feel it's not authentic. And then there's another group of people who seek out the other media, and there's a big divide as far as credibility, as far as what people will believe. And it's the thing that's so dangerous about it is because the mainstream media is all left-wing, and positively destructive, as you found out, to anybody who dares express a conservative opinion. What our concern is, how do you get through to that demographic if you can't get any traction in a newspaper, a standard newspaper at all?
I will answer that before pizza becomes the focal point of the evening. The challenge that I encountered, in one very notable example, the Liberals sent out a press release of, you know, the Doug Ford Conservatives need to get rid of Andrew Lawton as a candidate because of X, Y, Z. And they had the X, Y, Z very clearly laid out for people of things I had said. And these were things that were plucked from radio broadcasts I'd done in the last couple of years. And I read them, and I'm like, you know, I say a lot of things. Like, I utter a lot of words in the course of a day, but I don't remember saying this. And I know I wouldn't have said that. And one of them in particular was, let's ban Islam. That'll save a few lives. And I was like, you know, I've been very critical of radical Islam, but I've never... I'm a religious freedom advocate. I mean, I think the niqab and the burqa should never be banned. I mean, that's an issue that I'm prepared to stand behind never having said. And I went back one evening and I looked at the full, or I listened to the full transcript. And if you've never been as entertained in your life as I was listening to my own words from a year ago, it was a lovely evening. But I was listening back and I heard in the actual dialogue, as I was talking about knee-jerk reactions that government will do to a tragic event of some kind. And the point that I had made was, you know, what if government, every time one person died, decided to respond with banning something? Someone died in a car accident, ban cars. Someone died bungee jumping, ban bungee jumping. Someone died in an Islamic terror attack, ban Islam. And I was mocking the very idea that I was quoted as expressing. And Deb Matthews and the Liberal Party put out this press release. Andrew Lawton says, ban Islam. The papers published it as is. And even when we supplied them with the full transcript, we didn't even make them listen to my old radio show, because that would have been cause for a human rights complaint if you're a newspaper reporter and you have to listen to the Andrew Lawton show. But we supplied them the transcript, and they would not issue a correction. They would not issue a correction. And then you get people at the door that are saying, well, you said this. And I'm like, well, actually, I didn't. And again, well, they couldn't have written it if you didn't. And people are willfully ignorant because we've been trained to be a lot more trusting than the actual media are deserving of.
Which outfit was that?
It was that was Canadian Press. That was the London Free Press in my own city. And look, I mean, I was kind of tickled at one point that I was denounced by the Ontario Liberal Party, which is like that's the only honor that's above the Order of Canada, when you're denounced by Kathleen Wynne's Liberals. But again, when you can so demonstrably correct it and it still wouldn't be corrected, that is where we're talking about some major cognitive failings that are taking place here. It is. It's not incompetence. The initial publication may have been incompetence. Not correcting is malice. We'll continue this discussion. If you want to get food, get up. But if you don't, or you don't want to get in the line, we'll keep chatting in here in the meantime.
Yeah, we'll just take like a 10-minute break.
Okay, perfect.
All right, let's go back to Q&A. And you can ask Andrew questions as you eat.
Yes.
All right. Well, I was a very intelligent man talking about politics, and I assume about media as well, saying that it's ultimately about the ideas and not the persons. And one of the things that I imagine we probably all agree on is that we're increasingly seeing a polarization of the ideas that you're talking about, right? That as people move into their camps, they other the other. And I guess on a more kind of pragmatic, personal level, how would you suggest we move towards opening up dialogue to depolarize this kind of increasingly tense climate, both in media and in office?
For starters, not accepting the premise. And I don't want to rehash issues that Elsoy has been immersed in, but you have to pick your battles. But you also can't give up because you think a battle is not significant. A lot of the time they are. And when you look at academia really being at the center of the issues that we then see in politics, in the corporate world, and media, you have to fight it before it becomes so ingrained in the culture. I don't know if anyone's familiar with John O'Sullivan, who's just a fantastic English author. He has coined OSullivans First Law, which he said when I interviewed him once is actually his only law, but the name First Law, people expected him to come up with more. But this is, I think, one of the most important pieces of wisdom about that issue. Every institution that is not explicitly right-wing will over time become left-wing. So every single organization, foundation, charity, media outlet, school, unless it is explicitly a conservative group, it will eventually become a left-wing group. And this is hugely important when you look at the corporatization of media. You know, one of the people had mentioned the idea of independent media and where it's going to go in the future. And I feel that independent media and traditional media will ultimately converge, because media of the mainstream sense will realize that they're going to lose too much market share to keep going. They'll partner up with all of these independent types and use platforms like YouTube and Facebook. And people on the independent side who don't want to be bloggers in their bedroom anymore will see this big corporate money and will finally realize, yes, I can do what I want and have my own platform. When you are getting paid, you cease to be independent, though. And the question becomes where you're getting paid and how you're getting paid. And there are lots of people. I'm not denigrating anyone who is using Patreon or crowdfunding or anything like that, but that money's coming because you are doing something very specific. And if you are all of a sudden cultivating an audience that is different than the one that's funding you, you're going to lose that funding. And on the corporate level, if you're getting $50,000 a year, $100,000 a year from some company to do whatever it is you're doing, that corporate ethos will eventually seep into your coverage. And this is one of the big things that people need to be aware of, which is why I think opinion journalism is so important, because it is transparent. You know what it is that you're being told to think. It's not this exercise in the bias being hidden. And one great example of this, to talk about the Kokanee handshake again, which I hope to not have to do twice, but CBC, by its own admission, had this story earlier this year and sat on it. They did nothing. They sat on their hands, which in fairness, if Trudeau had done to his hands, we could have avoided the whole thing. But CBC had this story, they interviewed the woman, and they figured, you know what, it's not really newsworthy, and maybe it's not. Ultimately, when everyone else started talking about it, CBC decided, okay, we're going to do this. But corporations, and crown corporations especially, will adapt the ideology of whoever's backing them, which is why the CBC, whether Incompetence or Malice is to blame, decided we're not going to run this critical story of the guy that gave us an extra $100 million a year. And it's impossible to separate the two. And I feel that the institutional bias is going to be the biggest problem that we have to deal with, because it's institutions that are invested in a particular outcome. You know, I went on a trip that was sponsored by a pro-Israel group to Israel, and I was very clear when I talked about it on my show, look, this was a trip paid for by the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. I wasn't pro-Israel because they paid for a trip. They paid for a trip because I was pro-Israel. But that's an important distinction for a lot of people. But if you look at these online media outlets that are having the discussions that no one else is having, eventually when that becomes so big that there is big money involved in it, we'll have to be very cautious about what's happening. And I don't think it'll be good. I think there may be a correction that comes, but we need to break through that as much as possible to get through that idea that Greg was talking about there of not really debating the issues themselves. Yes?
So, talking about basically an entrenched media culture, academic culture, whatever. So what would your suggestions be to use alternative media to reach out to these audiences? I mean, to tell you the truth, as I'm listening to you, the only word that was running through my mind was samizdat, which, you know, it's kind of a scary way to think of where we're going. Are there other and, you know, possibly less cloak and dagger ways of getting out the messages and getting those audiences?
I think the big thing is, if you do see a product that you like, put the couple of bucks a month towards it. For starters, the biggest barrier to the really good people thriving in that independent media culture is the lack of resources. I mean, if someone were to say, Andrew, I'm going to give you $250,000 a year, and I'm going to build you a studio, and I'm going to pay you a salary, and I'm going to give you a staff, and you're going to do this, I could create something really great with that. Now, again, we go back to the discussion I had a couple of moments ago that you always have to look at where's that money coming from and what's the expectation and what's the product that's being delivered. But the best way to insulate an operation from that is for it to truly be a grassroots process. And I know The Guardian in the UK is trying to do the crowdfunding thing now, which I find quite amusing because it's novel in a way. I mean, The Guardian is trying to take, you know, the few pennies left after the government's taken its share of everyone in the UK's income. But the thing that I find fascinating about it is that it's probably the better way of doing it than what the Toronto Star and the National Post and the Globe and Mail are doing, which is saying, you know what, if you want to read more than 5 of our pieces a month, you've got to pay for it. When you look at the independent people, don't just give $5 a month to the guy or the gal that's saying what you like and making the good opinions, but fund the people that are actually doing independent investigations and the people that are actually showing the methodology of their work. Because as much as I hate to say this as a political commentator, people that are going to mouth off about, I think this on this are a dime a dozen. Some of them are entertaining. They offer a really positive thing to the discussion, and I think they're important voices. But the people that we really need to bolster are the ones that are actually doing what mainstream press aren't. And you look at whether it's what's going on in South Africa, whether it's what's going on at our borders now, whether it's what's going on in some of these flotillas that are going over to Gaza, whether it is, well, yes, that too. The issues that are happening there, you've actually got independent journalists that are going and actually doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. And in some cases, you need to take it with a grain of salt. In other cases, you can completely discount it. But you, as the viewer, ultimately gets to make that determination. And I think that if you see something that is of value, you have to actually respond by putting forward a couple of bucks, by sharing it. I have had so many people that when I ran as a candidate said, yeah, I'd love to support you, I'll donate, but I'm not going to post a link to your Facebook page. And I'm like, well, I don't care about the link if you're going to give me money. But this was a very big problem, though. People are terrified of being alienated from those in their circles because of their political viewpoint. And the media has cultivated that, where you need to be ashamed of feeling or believing a certain thing. If you want to combat that, you've got to have brute force, which means actually have people that are contributing something to combat the prevailing media narrative.
There's no animosity here, but I think you, by your own words, have contributed to people shutting their own mouths, because the Twitter feeds that you were not condemned for, but taken to task for, were, if my research indicates correctly, what would be traditionally considered to be on the very right side of conservatism. And your out for that was your mental illness. So by association, anyone who holds those points of view has some sort of mental illness. Would you care to comment?
Absolutely, I would love to. That was one of the most disheartening criticisms that I got from people that were on the right, that was the implication that was there. And it wasn't. I mean, when I talked about what was for me a very real battle, and one that I talked about at length, it was speaking for myself, and it was speaking for my own frame of mind. And the problem with that is that people took that to be me taking the ideological viewpoint of, criticism of radical Islamic terrorism, criticism of all of these other things, and making that a symptom of something, which wasn't the case. And I don't know, looking back, and I've thought about it, would there have been a better way to describe what was, I don't want to use such a subjective term, but my truth? Was there a way to better articulate what was for me very real without throwing conservatives under the bus, which was how some people, not a huge number, but some people viewed it. And I don't know the answer to that. I think that when I looked at the issues that I was very proud to have championed in a very articulate, reasoned, and passionate way as a broadcaster, those were things that I stood by as a broadcaster, I stood by as a candidate, and I stood by today. I wanted people to focus on the actual ideas, not the cheap laughs that weren't coming from the best place. And that was a distinction that was lost in not just the statement that I put out, but it was lost in the further diluted media coverage of that. And I think it's a good question. I don't have a great answer to it because I don't know.
Thank you for your honesty.
No, absolutely. And look, I think that we have to, as a general culture, not capitulate to that idea that, okay, because someone said something when they were going through a mental illness, that sometimes that could be about the form of expression rather than the actual ability to articulate something. And that was what I always tried to say, is that no, it's about the way that you communicate the idea, not the idea itself. And that was where I really saw in myself a lot of shortcomings. But no, I thank you for raising it.
Well, I just wondered, and as I said, I admire anyone who can stand up and run for political office, because Lord knows I cannot deal with the criticism. But I wondered if it was not in the heat of the campaign and you were seeing your cohorts being thrown under the political bus.
Oh yeah, no, and And that gets to a much bigger issue about how parties sort of expect the line to be towed. The dirty little secret about it all that has never really been shared is that the words that I said at the time were things that I had talked about already on my radio show about my own past, but never in writing and never in a place where it was coming from such a heated moment. So it was actually not at all reactive. It was quite proactive in that sense of something that I had already been talking about. But again, in politics, people will hone in on one particular application of something. And what was interesting is if you look at the further dilution of it, that mental illness discussion was applied to everything that I had ever said up until like a month before the campaign by some media. They're like, you know, Andrew Lawton said he was going through mental illness when he talked about, you know, it was sunny with a chance of showers on, you know, May 4th. And that was, I think, a problem that I wish I had been able to have a 3-month-long campaign like they did in the federal election, and you can take these people to task for it. And that was, well, I don't know about that, but one of the big problems is that you can focus on campaigning in the future and the present, or focus on campaigning in the past. And I could have sat at home and been on the phone all day with, you know, CP24 in Toronto and the Toronto Star and not get any votes, but feel like I'm fighting back, or I could have been out there doing the actual work. And obviously I'm here today not as a successful candidate, so maybe it wouldn't have mattered. But that's the big challenge, is that as a candidate, it was really disheartening to see how many things I had to just let go by because I couldn't take my attention away from the actual campaign to deal with a lot of it. Yes.
I'm trying to grasp at straws here, but at a...
You work for CBC?
No. No.
She works with turtles.
Okay.
At a meeting where there was a group of people who I would say was mainly conservative, a young woman who belonged, who was a lawyer and belonged to the Law Society, had developed an interesting technique, and it's something I feel that she's got something here if we could only figure out how to use it. And that is, there was a requirement at the Law Society where you had to sign on to a whole bunch of principles, including being in favor of abortion. It's the kind of thing you were talking about. And she managed to get some inroads by getting people to sign up at a website that said they didn't sign, because the Law Society said, well, this is entirely optional, of course. And of course, young lawyers and people feeling vulnerable would immediately say, well, I better sign up because I don't want to be left out. But she managed to get a few prominent lawyers to sign on to it, and she managed to get people to go public and say they hadn't signed on to it. And then more and more and more people were willing to A, not sign, and B, willing to disclose that they hadn't signed. And I think that this is one of the problems with conservatism, is somehow or other it's all kind of out there, very diffuse. If we could figure out a way to create a kind of community where people feel supported and they can say, okay, the CBC may be calling me names, but my group of people support me. And what seems to be, like with a straw, is how could one create that kind of community? Basically, I think the vehicles of social media or whatever, to give conservatives kind of a place to feel that they're not crazy and they're not bad, because that's what all the other media tells them they are.
Well, this is the OSullivans First Law at stake right there. The Law Society of Upper Canada, or the Law Society of Ontario right now, because Upper Canada made someone offended 350 years ago or whatever. The institution eventually becomes a left-wing institution. But we have to be very concerned about these quasi-governmental bodies. I mean, the Law Society of Ontario is not a government, but it is empowered by government. And if you want to be a lawyer in Ontario, you have to go through the Law Society. And in 5 years, if you want to be a chiropractor in Ontario, you're probably going to have to sign the affirmation. And if you want to be a salon esthetician or something, you're going to have to sign it. Especially with that case in Windsor, where the transgender person wanted to get waxed, and the Muslim person who worked at the waxing parlor didn't want to do it, and now there's a human rights complaint against the Muslim wax person because they have to do whatever. And the interesting thing about this is that the guy who owns the salon or the spa The guy who owns it has, donated to the Pride Parade. He's marched in the Pride Parade. I mean, he's your paragon of liberal tolerance, who's now between a rock and a hard place on this. And that is so important that the esthetician college is going to come out with, the 20 statement of principles for, if you have a transgender client, and the law society, and the medical schools, and all of that stuff. And it's hugely important for people to stand up against this. I mean, that law society attestation has been fought very significantly by a number of people. I know Bruce Pardy, who some of you may know, who's a law professor at Queen's, was very vocal in standing up against it. But then you look at Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party, whereas to run as a candidate in 2015, you have to sign the pledge that says you're pro-life. And in London, in the 2015, pro-choice, there we go. In London in 2015, there was a candidate who was running for the Liberal Party, did not win, but he had a green light rating from the Campaign Life Coalition, because when he was a provincial MPP, he was pro-life, and he was running as a Liberal. And I wondered why this didn't trigger any radar or any red flags at the Liberal Party headquarters. The guy's name was Khalil Ramal, which might actually indicate why there was a double standard. Because, Muslims and Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians on social issues have virtually indistinguishable positions when it comes to abortion and gay marriage and transgenderisms and all of this stuff. But people won't speak out against it unless it's evangelical. And that's why the Trinity Western Supreme Court case gave so much cover, because, they're evangelicals. If it was a Muslim madrasa in Toronto that had that same ideological outlook, no one would care. And I'm all for religious freedom, so I don't care if the madrasa is pro-life. I don't care if Trinity Western believes in chastity before marriage. I don't care about what private institutions do. But we need to be very wary of those institutions like the law societies that ultimately are behaving like governments, but they're kind of in the shadows, because no one who's not a lawyer has anything to do with the law society, so why do they care? But eventually it's going to be the organization that you're involved with. Eventually, to even work as a law clerk at a law firm, you're going to have to sign that same attestation. And if you allow these ideological purity tests to take hold, they're going to start being found in every single corner. You won't even be able to book the boardroom at the hotel here without saying, I believe in these, 14 statements and all of that stuff. And that's going to be something that is a lot nearer than we think.
But hasn't the Supreme Court decision actually almost enshrined that in law now? That you can demand these things. I mean,
it has.
It's probably the worst decision ever.
No, and this gets outside of the political realm here, but how many people can name 2 Supreme Court justices in Canada? And this is an educated, informed room. And Beverly McLaughlin doesn't count. She retired. Now, how many people could name 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices? Okay, there we go. So what does that tell you? Canadians, even those who care about these battles for liberty and free speech, have no idea what happens at the Canadian Supreme Court. We wake up one day and, I guess, Trinity Western can't be a law school and have its students admitted to the bar. Or, you can't bring beer from Nova Scotia or New Brunswick into Quebec. And that probably people care more about that than freedom of religion, I think. What do you mean I can't get a cheap six-pack from Quebec? It's about the only thing worth doing in Quebec. But the problem with... Who is booing? The problem with our Supreme Court in Canada, which is very activist in nature, is that it also operates in the shadows to so many people. And the problem is not the people. The problem is the institutions. And if you want examples of that, take a look at Stephen Harper, a fairly conservative, small c conservative prime minister who had a 10-year run as being the head of government. In 4 years of that, he had a majority government. He appointed the head of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. He appointed the head of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. He appointed Supreme Court justices. He appointed senators. He appointed the boards of the Canadian Human Rights Commission and the CBC. And this is not an indictment about Stephen Harper, but you can put in conservatives in these positions and the institutions will gobble them up. The institutions will. So the good thing is for the Supreme Court, they have a history of reversing their own decisions. So in 10 years, when another slew of justices is on there, it's a very real possibility that something like that could change. But we need Parliament to start playing a much more significant leadership role and actually voting on its legislative issues things that the Supreme Court is not going to do. And again, I go back to the abortion issue, not because it's the issue of the night, but because it tells us so much. When the Supreme Court ruled that abortion was legal, it did actually no such thing. It said Parliament needs to craft a new law, which 30 years later has not happened. So Parliament needs to step up, which brings us back to the grassroots discussions about the way we interact with politicians and what we demand of them. And I know that the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, which is a great organization on matters of liberty, has a list of legislative priorities that it's wanting to champion in government. And I hope they do that in Ontario and federally, because we need to start going to politicians and showing them that there is support when they do the right thing. And this is one of the biggest things that I would like to see happen more. And it's not that politicians are these delicate little snowflakes that need pats on the back, but they need to know there is a constituency for these issues. Because you know if they go on the other side, they're going to get absolutely eviscerated. If they say something pro-life, they're going to get eviscerated by the pro-choice lobby. If they say something pro-freedom of speech, they're going to get eviscerated by the same groups and more. If they say any of these positions that are deemed to be right-wing positions, they're going to be pilloried. We need to make sure when they do or say something good that they're actually being rewarded for that. And I don't mean just by voting for them and giving them money, but really offering support when the people are actually doing the stuff that they need to be doing. Because if you don't show up and say, yes, keep doing that, they're going to have no idea, and it feeds into that echo chamber that I started off talking about. So another hand. Yes?
Oh yeah, this is a little bit apropos of nothing, but well, actually you mentioned the word grassroots groups, I think a couple of times. So again, this is with no personal animosity, but I'm wondering what you can tell us about how you became the candidate in London West. Not because I'm interested in, again, it's no animosity. I'm just wondering what you can tell us about what that means about our new premier. Because, again, I was casually aware of the drama in London West, and I had a concern about that.
Yeah, that's fair. And the backstory is that I was running for the nomination to be the PC candidate, and about, I think it was 7 weeks before the election, I was appointed as the candidate. So there wasn't actually a nomination meeting as there was originally supposed to. It would be easy to look at Patrick Brown and say, where did you go wrong on this? And that's the discussion that I wish more people would have, because that was the most logical and simple way of understanding where the party was when Doug Ford took office. So the party had, I think it was 20, I used to know these numbers offhand, I think it was 27 or 28 ridings that as of January still didn't have PC candidates. And the election was scheduled for June 7th. It was a fixed election date. We knew it was coming for 4 years. And what happened was they were having these nomination meetings and they were mired in controversy. You had up in Ottawa ballot box stuffing where more votes were cast than there were people at the meeting. You had in Hamilton a police probe. You had a case even in London where, you know, the ballot boxes were sealed, but the guy from the party was walking around holding a bunch of ballots in his hand after the sealing took place. So you had a lot of these issues. Some of them the police are still investigating. You had a bunch of cases where leaked data from the 407, so if you ever paid to drive on the highway, you might have had a PC membership and had no idea. And a lot of that happened. So when Doug Ford took office, he had inherited not just the empty seats, and when Patrick Brown stepped down, the party lost 2 months of that calendar. But Doug Ford also inherited all of the baggage of all of these other ridings, which is why it was so important that any nomination that did happen, those 26 or 27, that they all happened by the book. And that was hugely important, and they were having 1 or 2 a week. They needed to be supervised by auditors. They had to have officials from Toronto. They could only do a couple of them at a time. And they were doing as many of these as possible, and then they ran out of time. And the party was handicapped by its own constitution because it needs to give 3 weeks' notice to have a nomination, and we got to the point where if you were to take 3 weeks forward, the campaign would have started, like the writ period would have begun. And they had 11 seats or 11 ridings across the province. London West was one of them that didn't have candidates, and they said, okay, we're going to appoint the people that we feel are best positioned to win. And it was disappointing in a way because we were pretty optimistic we were going to win. It created an issue that we were having to deal with that we didn't want to deal with because it was unnecessary. But on a more, and there's like the internal workings of politics here, it's kind of boring, but we ordered our signs and it took 2.5 weeks to get in. So if we had ordered our signs that last day possible for the nomination, we would have been a week and a half out from the election and only just then having our signs. So the party made a judgment call. I, as someone who now has somewhat of a standing in the party as a candidate of record, which is the nice way of saying a failed candidate. As a candidate of record, I would like to push for policy changes in the party so that this doesn't have to happen in the future. Because again, it brings us into a realm of discussing things that don't need to be and shouldn't be the focal point. I mean, I would have loved, because people were bringing that up, and understandably so. If I had paid my $10 as a party member, I would have been upset if this thing that I was expecting to do, voting in a nomination, didn't happen. But the thing that I found interesting is people would read about it in the paper and they'd at the door say, you know, I don't like how I didn't get a say in who the candidate was. And I'd say, oh, you're a member of the PC party? No. I said, well, how are you going to have a say? So people who have never been involved in the nomination process, who don't know how the nomination process works, were getting upset about this thing that happens all the time. And that doesn't make it right, but they were getting upset about this thing that happens all the time because they read about it. And the media finally decided to cover nominations when a lot of people that I know in the PC party had been trying to get the media to pay attention to the criminal nominations that had been happening for a year. So again, it certainly set us off on the wrong foot. I would love to have said it was not an issue, but I also can't, looking at all of the circumstances, say that that could have happened any other way, while us having really been able to have the same showing we did.
So how many of our current MPPs then would you say got the nomination by criminal?
Well, the criminal is a word that there's still investigations going. So I don't know. I know that in the two really notable examples where there actually was demonstrable lawlessness, those nominations were overturned. And one of them in Ottawa, the guy who should have won and lost the nomination, he won in a new nomination and now he's an MPP, Jeremy Roberts, and he's going to do a great job. There was someone else in Hamilton that again was overturned, and the replacement guy lost by a very narrow margin, but lost. The 407 stuff, I don't know the scope of that. I know that the media was covering it a little bit, but I think that that's another one where we'll never quite know what the impact was. The good thing is most of the people that were embroiled in scandal lost, or they had their nomination overturned before they were even running as a candidate. Yes?
I was wanting to talk to you a little bit about, still about politics, but more kind of from a philosophical point of view. I take from what you're saying about your tweets and kind of just your personal journey that you are looking to or looked to have a little more integrity for yourself. And I'm wondering, I've been interested in politics my whole life, and I think to myself, like, why are there still like fake people in politics? I thought it was like just a phase back when I first started getting into it.
It's a phase that's been going on for 151 years. It's going to end really soon.
Exactly, but I didn't know it was like.
It's not a bug, it's a feature.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is, obviously you chose to approach politics with a party,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm wondering, how do you see, what are your ideas about bringing integrity back into politics? Do you think it's by...
Bringing it back, when was it there? Let's start there. No, it's a very well...
That's true.
No, that's valid. And one of the things is the voters have to have a lot more discernment about what it is they're voting in. And I go back to my own example here, and this is the first time I've actually really gotten the chance to talk about it at length, which I'm very grateful for in some respects. And, you know, people that were jumping up and saying, okay, you know, how dare you have said this or tweeted this and whatnot, very, very legitimate criticisms. But these people are tacitly saying that they want unblemished politicians. No real human being is unblemished. And that's not to say that all blemishes are created equally. There's, you know, someone said something on Twitter, there's someone, you know, drove off a bridge with a woman and in Massachusetts and continued to get elected. And so some blemishes are okay. But people have to dispense with that notion that they're getting perfection in politicians. And it's so difficult because they do need to be held to a higher standard. But one of the big problems is that when we look at that, and we want people that have no criticisms that you can level towards them, no controversy, none of that, the people that you're getting are Justin Trudeau's. The people you're getting are people that have been groomed for positions from birth. And that's a huge problem, because the only people that live their life thinking of every decision through the lens of what will happen when I run for office are not the people you want in office. The people you want that are in positions of leadership are people that have lived experiences, people that have done something great, that have done something, they've created something, they've done some good works in their life.
Here.
That's, well, you know what, if no, I won't even say it. The thing that I will add, though, on that is that the voters should decide based on the real issues, and that's going to be the most important. I mean, if you have people that are not behaving with integrity, they will eventually be exposed. Maybe it's going to happen when they're running for office. Maybe it's going to happen 20 years down the road, but eventually it will come out. And if you look at the folders in any party whip's office, you'll find everyone has baggage. The question is just how well hidden it is and how damning it really is. Voters need to reward integrity. And if you want people with integrity in office, voters need to reward it. And it's not enough just to jump up and down when someone is not behaving with integrity. You need to actually have something that is working towards people that have that. And one of the greatest pieces of advice I got when I jumped into politics was, if you start cutting corners early, you're not even going to know you do it 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road. And you look at people whose political lives are like an episode of House of Cards. Like, it's instinctive to them to cut corners, to lie, to manipulate, to do whatever. And one of the greatest little political videos that I've seen was Rob Ford, as councillor, sitting at a table emptying out his wallet. And it was all of the different cards that he had as a councillor from the City of Toronto, the Metro Pass, the Zoo Pass, the Pass to the Expo, the Pass to Canada, like all of these things that he was given for free as a councillor, making $100,000 a year. And he was pointing out the absurdity of it. Most politicians, even the ones that go in there as conservatives, they want less government, they want, you know, taxes and spending to go down. They go in there, they see the checks, the receptions, the free trips, and all of that, and it consumes them. And that's why institutional challenges are so significant. I mean, there was a congressman, or actually he was a governor at the time in the US, that got on a plane to get a haircut. And then he, flew back home. And I'm like, I don't even want to drive 3 blocks on a Saturday morning to get a haircut, let alone hopping on a government charter, going to my preferred barber, 3 counties over, and landing and doing that. But these things come naturally to politicians when that's all they know. So if you put real people into positions of power, people that have not been living their entire lives at the teat of the taxpayer, you're going to see a shift. But it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to come naturally, and it's not going to be perfect. But there needs to be a lot more transparency to get there.
So to add to that, as someone who was a candidate, if other than voting, how would you have liked to have, for people to have supported you, to show, hey, I like what you're doing on Twitter?
Well, it's difficult, because on one hand, I said, and I do mean that Twitter is not real life. But it would have been really great if people would have been able to actually put themselves out there a bit more and take, for example, when I was misquoted, say, well, actually, here's what he said. And there were people that were messaging me privately, which I wasn't really reading that. My wife had to pry my phone from my hands during the campaign on a couple of days, but there were people that were sending, death threats and stuff like that, but actual messages that were positive, sort of saying, I'd love to support you, but, or I'd love to publicly support you, but I'm afraid of it. And you have to put yourself out there. And I don't know if any of you have heard, there's this professor named Jordan Peterson who had said something, well, many things very profound, but one thing in particular, which is that you're going to get punished for speaking up, and you're going to get punished for not speaking up. You don't get to choose no punishment, you just get to choose which punishment. And that, I think, is so important here. I mean, you're going to get absolutely ripped to shreds by people online if you speak up with a position that is wrong. But you're also losing in the long run if you don't speak up. So I think people need to speak up, and they need to, I'll start using some of the words that are familiar to people on campus. We need to start normalizing right-wing thoughts or left-wing thoughts that are maybe running afoul of the norm. But you need to start showing that these things do, in fact, exist. Yes.
Okay, actually, I'm really glad about the last thing that you said, because that's exactly the point that I was going to raise. And that is that right now, if someone wants to demonize somebody, I used to believe that political correctness was annoying and silly. But now I am understanding that it is incredibly malign, because all you have to do is show that somebody has said something that is politically incorrect and you sink them. So the real question is, how can we, exactly what you said, normalize, how can we rephrase, recast conservative principles so that people can adopt them, say them, and hold their heads up? Because right now, essentially, to admit that you voted conservative is to say that you are in favor of grabbing the bread out of the poor people's mouths. It's basically like the left and the liberals look like nice people, the conservatives look like they're awful. How can we change that perception?
That's a great question, and I want to answer that, but I also want to touch on the political correctness problem that you identified. So I'll bring you back to the year 2000. CBC was having a discussion about its editorial standards, and if anyone's ever worked in a newsroom, my condolences, but newspapers and media outlets have these things called style guides, which are these guides of how you refer to certain things. And in some cases, it's, you know, whether you capitalize or hyphenate certain words. And in other cases, it's whether you use committed suicide or died by suicide. Very politically loaded discussions that are in these. CBC had a series about whether they should change fishermen to fisher people or fishers, because it was offensive to the 3 women that work in the fishing industry on the East Coast. And this is a serious discussion, and they ran after they had conducted their months plural long analysis into this. They published a piece explaining that they were not actually going to be sexist and all of that. They were going to rename it Fishers. 2,400 words. This analysis of why they were in all of their coverage about the fishing industry, which I think was like 3 stories a year or something like that, they were going to use fishers. And included in the story was the admission that all of the women in the fishing industry actually liked fishermen. All of the women in the fishing industry actually like fishermen, but CBC was doing it at all. Now, if this happened today, people would be like, oh, well, you're being patriarchal and paternalistic, and you're telling women what they should feel and what they should think. We didn't have all of those terms to have these critical discussions at the time. But the thing was, they did this, and the Globe and Mail, for its part, had the same discussion at the time, and they realized, well, all the women fishermen actually are okay being called fishermen, so we'll keep it that way. It's more than words. The word is irrelevant. The word doesn't matter. It's the idea that is driving the need to sanitize certain language. When San Francisco, and I think it was 1990 or 1991, changed, I don't know if the change is still on the books, they changed manhole to utility cover. And the manhole was not allowed, it was utility cover. And I don't know if, again, that's still on the books today. But
it's going to go down there?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, I mean, no one was proposing woman hole, I assure you. But the thing was, I was talking about the word. Never mind. But the thing is, well, Justin Trudeau would have picked it up. But the problem we have here is that no one cared about the word, so everyone just let it go. Everyone just shrugged and said, this is a bit stupid. And same as my own city, London, Ontario, passed a bylaw 2 weeks ago banning people from feeding squirrels more than 250 milliliters of nuts. No, this is serious. I mean, so you take a little measuring cup and you fill it with nuts, and if it goes over, the bylaw officer is going to come and give you a citation for feeding the squirrels too much. But the thing is, I don't really care. I've never fed the squirrels more than 250 milliliters.
Why? If they eat too much, they're gonna wreck the parks.
Maybe, and now I don't know if that's shelled or unshelled, because if you shell them yourself, you can get more than you can. Yeah, but again, feeding the squirrels is not at all the hill that I would die on. But if you don't fight that, you give government license to control anything and everything. And when we go back to your broader point here, Susan, I think this is the one thing that people need to realize, is that these little minor political correctness changes that we see are not benign. And even the ones that seem benign never are in the long run, because they're coming from a place of people that understand the idea of moving the goalposts. And the opponents of free speech, the opponents of open discourse, they understand incrementalism. They understand what people on the right have, I think, oftentimes been far too pure in their fight of, because people on the right only want to have the big battles. But if you cede these little battles, eventually you're going to have lost the big battle and you won't even know when.
If I can speak to the last 2 points just from my limited experience, I think the other massive element is, we talk about Twitter as kind of a reflection or microcosm of the real world, but ultimately it's putting money where your mouth is, and that means boots on the ground. Mm-hmm. So if you care about something, I think that, to me, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like go out and talk to people that you don't know. Talk to people that you know don't actually agree with you, and then have that ability. That might mean volunteering for a cause or a candidate, in this case, that you really kind of believe in. But that's what I've always kind of understood to be like, that's where it really counts. If you believe in something, put in 5 hours a week. If it really means that much to you, talk to 5 people that you don't know. And it might not mean a conversion or something natural like that, but that kind of really gets to the heart of it. Otherwise you have an echo chamber.
I go back to that story about Chicopee, Massachusetts, a bunch of Harvard students that had probably never in their lives met a Trump supporter. Something like that goes a long way, and like you said, Greg, I mean, you're not going to win them all, but you're going to show people that there is a legitimate way to view a certain issue that is different than their own, or at the very least that you're not an evil, reptilian baby eater for saying that. I mean, you might be. And notice, I don't want to be reptiliophobic here or anything, but there is in fact a way that you can express a different viewpoint that doesn't have to be resulting in your imminent demonization. And there are some people that are not going to do that. I saw a video today, which I might tweet it out, because this has the potential to go viral for all the wrong reasons. It was a forum in, I think it was New Brunswick, about female genital mutilation, which is just an absolutely barbaric, disgusting practice. And there was a presentation by a doctor in Toronto, from Toronto, who does the reversals of these, of young girls that have been mutilated. He does the reversals. And at the end of it, there was a gentleman, to use the term dishonestly, there was a guy who stood up and was very polite, but he said, the concern that I have when we criticize this is that it's coming from a colonialist mentality. And the poor doctor actually said at one point in this, and the doctor said at one point in this, and I can't remember the exact wording, but rest assured I'm not paraphrasing in a way that loses the meaning. I didn't know we were debating the merits of female genital mutilation. I thought everyone would agree it was a bad thing. But people were actually splitting hairs over something that is so unequivocally barbaric, because the criticism of it is coming from a settler mentality, and it's the way we condemn. But here's the thing, though, and the guy said, who was criticizing this, he's like, and I'm not saying the practice isn't bad. I'm saying that the way we discuss it, the language we use, is coming from a colonialist place. And he says that he is not defending the practice. And in his mind, he's probably not. In his mind, he's doing God's work, or whatever the deity he worships' work is. He, in his mind, is doing the right thing. But they get so caught up on the language discussions that the outcome is that you can't have a discussion about female genital mutilation with the base premise that this is a bad thing. And I've actually encouraged myself in the last 30 seconds to write about this, because people need to understand that even the discussions that you think are done and settled one way are actually not. And the problem is that the left has succeeded and the media has succeeded of saying that their issues are settled. When something like this happens that you think is an objective truth, the debate is all of a sudden moved into a new realm. Give it 5 years and all of a sudden to even have a dialogue about female genital mutilation will be colonialist and racist and something like that, which is why you need to deal with these issues as you see them.
So you just mentioned that the left has succeeded in promoting the narrative, and it's pretty much paramount that they have a monopoly on every single issue, whether it's racism or freedom or whatever the case is. So the question is, where did the right fail in promoting the specific values? The right had also have these certain values. Where do you think, where's the failure here?
Late 80s, late 1980s.
Sorry, before you say, and why is it they're not able to connect with the millennials and the women's voters in general?
Well, the millennials are, and I say this as someone who's in that millennial generation more broadly, as much as I dislike that designation, but the millennials are, they're exposed to only one side from cradle to graduation and then into the workforce. So that's the academia problem. But the reason the right failed is because the right ignored the two major battlegrounds for these cultural issues. Number one, academia, and number two, culture and entertainment. The right ignored these things. The right ignored the 1960s and the protest songs. The right ignored the creep of academia to go far left in the 1980s. The right ignored all of these left-wing celebrities and the left-wing films and the messages in the music that were actually leading people to a certain belief system, or at least fostering it, and the right ignored that. And when Alan Bloom in 1987 wrote an absolutely tremendous book, The Closing of the American Mind, we didn't even have the word political correctness. That wouldn't enter the lexicon for another 4 or 5 years. But he was writing about students in universities. This will sound hilarious to a lot of you. Students in universities, are all of a sudden starting to ask whether, the classics can be read in their historic context instead of in a modern context. And now you're like, well, that's the only way. The only way people will read these things is by, Shakespeare's a racist and Plato is a homophobe and all of these things. But at the time, he was like, this is kind of weird, this thing. And that was in 1987. We are now 30 years later, and now you can't at all talk about any issue without it being filtered through a historical, intersectional, transracial lens. And that's where conservatives have failed in understanding where the battlegrounds for these real issues were. And conservatives were too focused, especially in the US, at elections. This all happened while Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush were president. So there was a conservative government for a 12-year span in the United States, while academia was tilting so far to the left. And 30 years later, we're still seeing the implications of that. So conservatives need to engage in these cultural battles. I think a lot of people, especially when you look at the YouTube stars that we're seeing emerge, are doing that. But there's an overcorrection, because now you have this entire genre of conservative art, which is synonymous with just bad art. Because you have people that are like, I'm making a conservative film. No, what you mean is you're making a bad movie, but you're a conservative. Or have you ever heard a good conservative song? No. I mean, there are songs that might have a conservative message, or movies that have a conservative message. But if you make something that puts the identity first, it means that the actual art is secondary. And one of the best books that I read as far as political philosophy was Atlas Shrugged. The movie was absolutely terrible. The movie was The Audience Shrugged. Like, that was the whole point of this, is that it was just this boring bad movie because they thought, we're going to appeal to conservatives with this. And no, you don't need to preach to the choir. I want a comedian that's going to be a funny comedian. And if they're not making their jokes at the expense of Donald Trump and everyone who likes Donald Trump and everyone who's a conservative and, oh, Christians are so stupid and all of that, then I'll laugh at it. But we can't respond with our own version of what the left has been doing, because they've got that market cornered. I don't know if anyone watches the show Nashville. It used to be so good, and it's gotten so awful, because the show used to be about like the last bastion of like somewhat conservative-friendly art in the US, country music. And in the last 2 seasons, they've got the transgender character, they've got the Harvey Weinstein record executive, they've got the gay cowboy who's combating homosexuality in the country industry, they've got the black person in Nashville. And there's nothing wrong with this, but every episode of this show is now a moral lesson. It's a moral lesson about how the people that are watching a show about country music are backwoods, bad people. And it's the last season, so I'm seeing it through to the end. And it's not even like Glee, where you at least get the good Journey cover in the middle of it. They've even like taken the music out of the seasons now. But if you try to ram moral messages down people's throats, they're going to reject them. So there needs to be a way where we as consumers support good art that's being produced by people that are like us, but not just because we like the message that's coming.
Essentially what you're talking about is not like a political avenue, it's a meta-political avenue, right? So for somebody who has gone through the political system and has realized what it really takes and how possibly backstabbing and how nasty the entire world is, are you saying in some way that it really is up to culture producers, people who create films, who create videos, who write, who make music to change minds instead of, you know, legislature or individuals who have political sway.
It's a team effort. I don't think any one group is going to be the cultural force. I do think, though, that we need to dispense with this notion that politicians are leading the charge. I mean, politics by nature is a reflection of sentiments that already exist in society. And when you mentioned earlier about integrity in politics, most political candidates and elected political leaders are not interested in leading on specific issues. They'll sit and they'll wait and they'll see where the group is, and they'll go in that general direction. Now, I always, when I was faced with issues on the campaign, even in just a couple of months, would try to do a bit of both. I mean, I want to see where the shared premise is. You know, if I'm talking to someone, ideally I want to keep going back until I find what can we agree on. And in some cases, you've got to really go way back. Like, in all honesty, if you ever try to do this, like in some cases it's okay. Do we agree that, that taxes are theft? No? Okay. Do we agree that you have the right to your property? Okay, no? All right. Do we? And then eventually it's like, do we agree that, there is a moral right and a moral wrong in the universe? And if they say no there, you move on to the next door. But this, I wasn't doing this at the doors, but you need to find what is it you actually agree on, and you build that as the foundation. And I think that in politics, it's very easy for political candidates and politicians to preach, not to the choir necessarily, but to preach to what the audience in front of them at that particular moment wants to hear. Whereas if we're talking about a social shift or a societal shift, we need to make sure that there is enough cover, if I can use a more pessimistic word, enough cover for politicians to respond the way we want them to respond. And that comes with what Greg was saying earlier. I mean, if there's a politician that you really stand behind, volunteer for them. I mean, go out and support them, not just with a vote. If there's an artist that's producing something you want, support them. If there's an independent journalist, support them. But you need to create a realm in which it is, to repeat the point earlier, normalizing this worldview, because otherwise you're never going to get a politician rising up that is going to legislate on that. You can't ignore legislative change. I mean, but let's look at some key moral issues here. Sex ed is one example. If the goal of some of the fiercest critics of the current sex ed curriculum are like, we don't like some of the age inappropriateness of this, or we don't like that it's subverting parents, or whatever the case may be. If parents step up and instill in their kids what they want the kids to know, and pull their kids out of the public school system, and do all of these things, then what happens in the public school curriculum in the education ministry is irrelevant, because people have basically gone around government. And it's the same with issues of morality like the abortion issue. If you are a fierce pro-life advocate and you can accomplish your aim of eliminating abortion through education, it doesn't matter if it's legal or illegal. It doesn't matter if legislators respond, because you've made the change in the culture. There are some issues like taxation where, yeah, it has to be government. I cannot just, conscientiously object to paying my taxes, much as I try. Or the one that I love in Ontario is when you get the option at the bottom of your taxes, do you wish to donate to the Ontario Opportunities Fund, which is, do you want to help pay down the provincial debt? And I'm like, well, if they start leading by example and actually trying to pay down the debt, maybe I'll give them a couple of bucks. But you have to make sure that politicians are aware that there is a force in the first place. And the way we get there is by going through the culture. And I don't just mean through arts and entertainment, but through discussions like this, quite frankly.
I think this touches on something which is something where I feel conservatives have a weakness, inability to build coalition. Somebody quoted to me, it was my good friend Salim actually, who said, Reagan said that just because somebody is 80% my friend doesn't mean he's 20% my enemy. And that is, there's a tendency of a kind of purism with conservative thought, that unless you're with me 100% of the way, I don't want to talk to you, you're no good. Whereas I really think that conservatives, if they could find the common ground and work together with the common ground and say, we have a common agenda, let's push that, and let's put aside a few issues that I have for another day, that we might get further.
We saw that in, I think it was 2014, when radical feminists, and I don't mean feminists who are radical, but the actual worldview of radical feminism, were teaming up with the federal Conservative Party on the prostitution issue. because they had a shared goal that, you know what, you should not be able to buy or sell sexual services. And whether people agree or disagree with that is an entirely irrelevant point in this particular juncture, is that there was a coalition there. And we see that now on the transgender issue, where radical feminists are not on board with a lot of this, which is why there's this new word that I've only just seen in the last few days called TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists. And there's an acronym for every occasion, I'm learning. But yeah, no, don't focus on the word. It's just, but the trans-exclusionary radical feminists are now being vilified by the trans-inclusionary radical feminists, which are also TERFs, I guess, if you pronounce it. But the trans-inclusionary are there, and we're seeing a fracturing of the liberal coalition now, which I think is very interesting. We're seeing white feminism versus intersectional feminism, and radical feminism versus the inclusionary feminism, and we're seeing this, and when you see comedians like Amy Schumer and Tina Fey, who are left-wing comedians, who are getting up and saying, I don't like this whole everyone's being offended by everything, we are seeing the fracturing of the coalition, and I don't know who's going to be the last one standing. I was going to say the last man standing, but I realize you can't say that anymore. But I don't know who's going to be the last one standing. But conservatives need to take advantage of this, basically. And I don't just mean political conservatives. People who are on the right on whatever this issue is need to realize that. And I was very proud in my campaign. I may be the only politician in the history of Canada who had the endorsement of Campaign Life Coalition and Mark Emery. And this was important. I had social conservatives and libertarians and red Tories. I had Chinese Canadians. I had Muslims. I had evangelicals. I had Latin Mass Catholics. I had atheists and libertarians.
And the pot smokers, don't forget the
I didn't have many of them. They aren't good at getting out in the morning to go canvassing, but they donated. There was one guy, I knocked on his door, and he opened the door, and it was like a cloud of smoke came, and I'm like, is it July 1st already? And anyway, and he was like not interested in politics at all. And then I was like on a whim, I was like, Mark Emery donated $250 to my campaign last week. He's like, you got my vote. So politics makes for strange bedfellows, I realize. However, this was an example. For me, I used to be someone who would align more as a social conservative. Now I'm in this weird social conservative libertarian hybrid where I am a libertarian who believes that socially conservative values should be championed not by the force of state, but by religious institutions, schools, and families. And that is a very unique place, but I've also seen how the libertarians reject the social conservatives and the social conservatives reject the libertarians. And we saw that in the PC leadership race, where there were a lot of people that were outraged that Tanya Granick-Allen got to be the kingmaker. But she was. And Doug Ford won with red Tory support and social conservative support and libertarian support. A lot of the social conservatives in the Greater Toronto area, the ethnic communities, which again, the left has traditionally thought it had a monopoly on, immigrants. And they're finally realizing that isn't the case. But we are finding that there can be coalitions that you wouldn't expect. But it doesn't come easily. There are going to be these nasty schisms that exist where one group just storms out. Alberta, if you look what's happening there, has seen that it's important to bring both of the conservative parties back to the fold together, because otherwise you're doomed for losing elections, which is what the federal conservatives went through. But you can't win a cultural battle if your team is fracturing into a bunch of little teams. And I know we're running out of time here. I'll stay around to answer any questions one-on-one, but the one little story I'll end with, which maybe when we close is the way you want to learn something of this, but the National Association of Students in the UK, which was it was like a student union here in Canada, so you know exactly the ideological leaning they had. They were getting together and they were showcasing women's issues at the conference, and there was an issue that was raised that they had to correct by sending out a notice to all students that applause was to be banned, because some students who were hard of hearing would be triggered that they couldn't hear the applause. So students were to do jazz hands instead. This is real. The National Union of Students, rather, in the UK said everyone had to do jazz hands instead of applauding. And then I'm like, well, the blind people can't participate. They can't witness the jazz hand. So I don't know. And jazz was a cultural appropriation from, I think, Black America in the 1950s. So, but you could take these stupid little discussions and always find some group that feels excluded by it. And we see that happening, and eventually people will start coming. And when you look at people like Frances Widdowson, who is not a conservative by any stretch, that's addressing a group like this, and Lindsay, by her own admission, someone who is not this conventional conservative that's becoming more alert to these issues, as we all are, I think that's where we need to understand there is opportunity in chaos here, and that eventually the left is going to alienate all of its, to use their word, allies. And we need to make sure that we're in the business of collecting allies rather than alienating them ourselves. Thank you so much for the invitation, everyone. Thanks for coming.